Didn't they do a great job? Join me again in expressing appreciation to the choir and all the worship leaders here. Such a wonderful time together this morning. And Debbie and I are just most grateful for the opportunity to come back and share this special day with you here at Glen Hope this morning. And it really is indeed a time of celebration for my heart, and I trust it is for your heart as well. You know, I can't help but think back to the very first time that I stood in this pulpit to share God's Word with you and to sense the difference in the Spirit of God moving among you, and to see the hope and the excitement and the anticipation of what God has done and what God is doing. And I just rejoice here this morning. And Fred, it's so good to see you this morning. I first met Fred Treadwell 21 years ago when he brought a very young man into my office when I was the director of missions of the Mount Zion Association. His name was Bud Wren. And he was a young guy then, wasn't he, Fred? And we were a lot younger. When God had birthed in the mind and heart of Bud and Fred, and ultimately affirmed by this church to launch Integrity Community Church. And Fred, it's so good to see you this morning. Glad you're here. You know, one of the things that I'm just reminded of today as I see and experience this time together with you is that God is faithful. He always has been faithful. He is faithful. And God did not leave you, nor did He forsake you, even when there were times, and there have been times, when you could not see His hand moving in a purposeful direction. There were times when you wondered, is God still with us? Is God still anointing us? Is God going to continue to be with us into the future? But we can affirm today that He always has been and will continue to be faithful. This morning, God has led me to revisit with you one of my favorite Old Testament characters. You've heard me talk about this guy more than once during the year that I was here with you. But I want us to think about one of my favorite characters, Joshua. Joshua, you will remember, was the son of Nun. He was Moses' assistant. He was Moses' successor. He was the military leader that God chose to lead the Israelites in the conquest of Canaan following the death of Moses. In the book of Numbers, we find the story during the Exodus from Egypt when Moses sent 12 men from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land of Canaan, to scope it out, and to bring back a report. There were only 2 of the 12, you will recall, that brought back a report that encouraged the Israelites to be faithful to God, to be courageous, to move on and do what God had called them to do. The majority, however, 10 of the 12, they lacked that kind of faith. They looked around and they saw all the obstacles. They saw all the giants. They saw all the problems. And they recommended that they not move forward. And, of course, the crowd, if you will, the majority of people said, well, you know, there's all these obstacles in the land, so I think we ought to follow the lead of the majority. This just a quick aside. It always goes back to remind me that even though in most Baptist life we go by this idea of majority rules, the majority is not always right. We need to stop and we need to pray and we need to be faithful. We need to try our very best to understand what God is up to, where God is leading, what God's about. Then we need to be courageous and move forward as He leads. Well, what happened to the Israelites because they were fearful? Because they were not willing to take a chance. They were not willing to take a risk. You remember the story. They were left to wander in the desert for 40 years, and all those who were 40 years and younger perished there in the wilderness. And when the Lord announced to Moses that he was about to die, that he was about to move off the scene, Moses said, well, who's going to lead the people? Who's going to take us from this point forward? And the Lord appointed Joshua to that position. And after Moses' death there on Mount Nebo, Joshua's leadership was confirmed by God, and God then told Joshua the time is now. It's time to move forward into the promised land, to take possession of the land of Canaan. And I want you to know, and it just brings joy to my heart, that during the entire year that Debbie and I served here with you, God was at work faithfully to bring and prepare Lewis and his family to come here and serve you as pastor and family. Now, during most of that year, he didn't know that. During most of that year, you didn't know that. But I want to remind you that God was working when you didn't understand or know what he was about. He was working, and he has been faithful to you. And he meets the needs of the church family here at Glen Hope today, and we celebrate that this morning. In your Bibles, Joshua chapter 1, I want to read the first 10 verses just to remind us and set the context for what I want to share with you this morning. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, who was Moses' assistant, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, all of this, he said, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it night and day, so that you may be careful to do all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and be not dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." After Moses died, Joshua took up the reins of full leadership of Israel. Now I'm certain that as he stood there, as he contemplated where they had been, what was before them, I am certain that he had a lot of fear and trembling in his heart at some level. But he assumed the leadership, and as he was faithful, and as he did what God told him to, the Lord appeared, he calmed his nerves, and he set his resolve. In these verses, I think we can easily identify three concepts I want to mention very quickly this morning in our time together. It's trust, obey, and remember. Trust, obey, and remember. As we look to the future, we should be reminded, first of all, to trust God. God called upon Joshua and the people to believe certain things. First of all, he called them to believe that the land of Canaan, all that expanse before them on the other side of the river, it was God's gift to his people. God had prepared this for them. God wanted this for them. God always wants the best for his people. 3 times the Lord stressed that he was giving Canaan to Israel. He left no doubt that they were going to possess it, emphatically saying, "It shall be your territory, and you shall divide it as an inheritance to the land." Now, what does that mean for Glen Hope as we stand here today? You are even right now in the process of crossing the Jordan to take possession of the land, if you will, the future that God has before you. You're ready to occupy a new chapter in the rich history of this church. I like your new slogan, "Hope lives here." That brings me hope. That brings me joy to hear that. And you're going to demonstrate that. Now, a slogan is only a slogan unless you live into it. A slogan is no more than a few words unless it actually means something. But you've not only come up with a slogan, you've developed a mission statement that will enable you to realize that slogan. And this vision of bringing hope by making and equipping disciples to worship God, serve others, and build God's kingdom is a hope-inspiring vision. I was so encouraged to see that you're going to be just now introduced to Robbie Gallaty's Growing Up book. It's one of the finest pieces I have ever seen. I was telling your pastor, I almost didn't recognize Robbie. The last time I saw Robbie, he looked like a bear. He had this full, thick, black beard, and he was so clean-shaven on the video this morning, I almost didn't recognize who he was. But I love this man's heart. And in case you didn't notice, you may have not noticed on the video, the other guy sitting there on the platform was David Platt. He made reference to David. David's our current president of the International Mission Board. So Robbie Gallaty was discipled by David Platt. It's a fine study. I hope you'll do whatever it takes in your life and in your schedule to be a part of that. But as you continue in this direction, developing yourself, first of all, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, growing in faith, growing in your journey with Him, and reaching out to engage with a few others in this journey, and then multiplying that through the community, that is the future of this church. It's the future of every church. Second thing I want to show you is the assurance of that Israel's enemies would be defeated. You can see that in verse 5, that He called the people to believe that the enemies would be defeated. 40 years earlier in the text, the people of Israel, they wavered in their faith, they wavered in their commitment because the spies had seen these great giant warriors there in the land of Canaan. Now, make no mistake, as Joshua stood, Joshua the new leader, as he stood with the people there on the bank of the Jordan, those warriors were still there. The enemies were still strong. But God promised Joshua, and He promised the people that they would have success against all the overwhelming odds that seem to be before them. Today, it bothers me to hear so much truth, if you will, about the crisis of the church in our country. The church in America, the church in the Western world, if you will, I've shared with you many times before over the last year, the church is in trouble. There is a crisis in the church, but we need to not allow ourselves to become discouraged in the face of that. This is just like it was for Joshua and the people as they stood there on the banks of the Jordan looking out at Jericho, looking out at the huge armies of the cities of the plains. He saw all these before them, and in the very same way, there is a legitimate crisis in the church in America today, but it is not a crisis that God cannot overcome as He uses and works through His people. God has assured us today that the enemies of His church will ultimately be defeated. There are many who wish to marginalize the church. There are many who wish to destroy the church. But God's Word assures us that those enemies will not prevail if and when God's people seek Him. When that happens, and He's going to come to them, and in His strength will be victory. It's not in our strength. I've shared with you before. I'm not strong enough. You're not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. You're not smart enough to figure our way through the issues that confront every church in our land today. But God is able. He is able. He's strong enough. He's smart enough. He knows exactly who's here. He knows exactly what the needs are. He knows exactly what the obstacles are. And He will bring victory to His people who remain faithful. Because in verses 5 and 9 we see that the Lord is present. He has not departed from us. Just imagine the great affirmation that Joshua experienced in his life as he heard the Lord say to him, in the very same way that I was with Moses, I'm going to be with you. Now, Joshua couldn't look ahead and see the future any better than you and I can look ahead and see the future. But he could look back and he could see the faithfulness of God in the life of Moses, his servant. And God said to Joshua, in the very same way that I was with Moses, I'm going to be with you. The God who has brought great success and victory in the life of this church in the past, that same God is with you today and will be with you every step of the way into the future. God is going to be present. God has provided you, Glen Hope Baptist Church, with a Joshua, if you will, in the form of your new pastor and family. And in the very same way that God has been with this church throughout her history, He remains with you today. God is saying to Lewis, He's saying to deacons, He's saying to Sunday school teachers, He's saying to every leader and every member of this church, be strong and of good courage. Be strong and of good courage. Why? Because I, that is God, will never leave you nor forsake you. We notice also, following the call to believe was the call to obey. The Lord's promises to Joshua did not mean that he and the people had no responsibility. God said, I'm going to be with you and I have enough strength for everything that you need, but there is a responsibility that comes for the part of the people as well, and that is to be obedient. He said to observe and do everything according to all the law. He wasn't to deviate from it in any way. He was to keep it on his mouth and in his mind. He was to do all that was written in the law. He was not to be satisfied with partial obedience. I don't know about you, but I struggle a lot of times with partial obedience. There's so much that God says, so much that's revealed to us in His Word that I can get along with okay on a day-to-day basis. But then there's the hard stuff, right? There's hard stuff in this book. There's hard stuff in God's Word that most of us struggle with from day to day. And we're not to be satisfied with partial obedience because God explicitly tied success to their obedience. In the very same way, the promises that God speaks to you today, individually in your heart life and family, collectively in the life of this church, will never be realized apart from your continuing obedience to His plan for the church. Continuing obedience to His will for the church. You must discover it. You must continue to spend time in prayer and in this book, working with your pastor and other leaders to understand, more completely understand. You're moving in the right directions, but to fully understand what God's will and His plan is, because He always blesses that. And He doesn't make any promises about blessing our wants and wishes. But when God's people unite around the core duty of obedience, we can rest assured that God will bless in very particular ways. As you stand at this milestone in the life of your church, it's important for you to consider what obedience looks like moving into the future. You have some sense of what obedience looked like in the past. And obedience in the future may or may not look like what you remember from your past. A good question. You know, there's some limitations to this, but you remember the little popular wrist bracelets from years gone by, WWJD, what would Jesus do? That's not a bad question to ask. Day to day in the life of our individual lives and the life of the church. What would obedience look like for this church and in this community today? What would Jesus do if He were here? You say, well, I don't really know what He would do. Sure you do. Or you can know. You go back and read the Gospels. You go back and read the Gospels and see how Jesus interacted with people. See how Jesus loved people. See how Jesus saw people. We need to be doing that very same thing today. I want to remind you again. You heard me remind you for a year. It's not about us. It's not about us. But we live in a culture today where it seems to be about us. It really seems to be about us. Everything is catered to what I want, how I want it, when I want it. But it's really not about us. In order for you to continue to realize God's presence and His blessings for this church today, we must put God first, others second, and ourselves third. Church cannot be about our preferences. I was at a meeting just this past week with Dr. Steve Courts. He's the pastor of Center Grove Baptist Church in Clemens. And when Steve came to Center Grove was a broken church of maybe 300 people. In the midst of a large, growing area, there were huge needs in the community. Today, Center Grove worships around 15, no, maybe not 15, around 1,000 people. God has certainly blessed the life and ministry of that church. But here's what Steve Courts said. Son of Mark Courts. Some of you may remember Dr. Mark Courts, a leader in our convention, pastor. He was the pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in Winston-Salem. But Steve said this. He was talking about worship. And he said, you know, I love the old hymn, Love Lifted Me. Any of you know that? Say, I like that too? Yeah. He said, but you know, he said, we don't sing Love Lifted Me at Center Grove Baptist Church today. He said, I love it. He said, I sing it in my quiet time. He said, but the people that God has brought around Center Grove Baptist Church today, they don't respond to that music. It's not their heart language. And that's not what brings them to God. And he said, I sing these old hymns in my quiet time, but we don't sing it in our church. And it's not because I don't like it. And it's not because I don't love it. It's because I've realized that we have to do whatever it takes within the gospel to reach people for Christ. And it reminded me there of 1 Corinthians 9:19. You just might want to jot that down. We're not going to preach from that this morning. I want to bring you a thought about it. Paul said there, although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. What is he saying there? He's saying a lot, but among other things, he absolutely is saying this. I am dying to myself. I'm making myself a slave to others and their preferences in order to win them to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul was free. He made himself a slave in order to win more people. And in verse 23 he says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. I do it all for the sake of the gospel. That's what's necessary for this church and every church. We must get to the point that we give up our personal preferences. Not because we have to, but because we're willing to. Not because somebody takes them from us, but because we're willing to set them aside in order to make the main thing the main thing. Okay. Final emphasis from our text this morning is to remember. In Joshua 3, we find the people of Israel crossing the Jordan. They're moving across, taking the first steps toward claiming the promised land. Then when we move on over to chapter 4, we find what seems to be a very unusual story. Now I'm going to close with talking for just a minute about this story. God instructed Joshua to choose 12 men. They represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And he instructed them to take a stone from the bed of the Jordan and carry those stones to the place that they would lodge for the evening. And Joshua took these 12 stones and set them up as an altar. They set them up as a pile, if you will, there in Gilgal. And why? You ask why. Why did they do that? Why did they take these stones out of the river and set them up and pile them up there on the shore? And it was so that when their children, listen to me, when their children would come to them in the future and ask, what's that pile of rocks about? What's that pile of rocks about? What do these stones mean? They could recount for them how God had moved in a mighty way and he dried up the Jordan River so they could pass over on dry ground. It gave them an opportunity to recount a mighty act of God for their children. These memorial stones were there to remind the people we were facing. What were they facing? They were facing the Jordan River. They were facing the Jordan River at flood stage. It seemed that there would be no way that they could cross over, even though Joshua said, God has said for us to go. They looked at a mighty obstacle. They were facing this, but then God. What did God do? He caused the water. Now this is hard for our modern minds to comprehend. He caused the water in the Jordan River flowing at flood stage to pile up. Can you imagine water piling up? Just not down, but the water just piled up. And the riverbed dried up. And the people were able to move across to receive the gift of the future, the promised land that God had given them. The activity of our God is extremely important. We can never, ever forget it. There's a real sad story in Judges chapter 7. Judges chapter 2, rather. It tells about the people, they served God all faithfully during the days of Joshua. You know, they had this hiccup during the days of Moses. They spent 40 years in the wilderness. They followed Joshua to the promised land, and they were faithful. it says that all that generation were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord. And all the work that he had done for Israel. And they abandoned God, and they followed after false gods. So here's the truth. Unless we, as followers of Jesus Christ, communicate the reality of the gospel to the next generation, they will not know it, and they will not follow him. Today is a special day of remembering for you here at Glen Hope Baptist Church. So I want to ask you, as we close, to think along these lines. We were facing. Think about it in your own personal life. Think about the life of this church as well. I was facing. We were facing. But then God. God is faithful. He has been faithful in your past. He will be faithful in your future. I was facing. What were you facing? Many of us, we face mountains, haven't we? We face mountains that seemed insurmountable. And we faced valleys that seemed so deep there was no way to cross. But then God. We were facing. But then God. The most powerful story in Scripture that describes this is found in Ephesians chapter 2. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you once walked. But God. You were dead. But God, being rich in mercy, made us alive together with Christ. This table today. You were dead, but then God gave you. Father God, we thank you for the truth of your word today. We thank you for the challenge this morning. And I pray, Father, that you would move and work. Continue to do that in our hearts and lives and the life of this church. In Jesus' name.